It's my real honor to introduce our other panelists, Dr. Jiahao Chen and Dr. Moise Busogi. So the panel discussion is entitled Trustworthy AI and Lending. And as I said, we have Dr. Busogi from Carnegie Mellon, Africa, as well as Dr. Chen from Parity Technologies. So in the previous talk, we actually were going into a lot of technical details and different considerations, talking about explainability, fairness, and so forth. For this panel, what we wanted to do was use a specific context to also explore those sort of concepts. And so we chose lending, and I'll go into kind of the setup, but first I will ask our panelists to say a little bit more about themselves. So first we have Dr. Busogi, who's an instructor at Carnegie Mellon, Africa in Kigali, Rwanda. And his research interests are in operations research, machine learning, and agent-based modeling. So Moise, please say a few more words about your background for the audience. Thanks.
Thanks, Kush. So it's a privilege to actually be here and being part of this very interesting and timely conversation. So my name, as Dr. Varshney said, is Moise Busogi, and I'm from Rwanda, right now in Kigali at the CMU Africa campus. So before joining CMU Africa, I was in Korea for around 12 years, where I basically did my undergrad, master's, and PhD in Korea, KAIST and UNIST. And I did control engineering, basically like system design and control engineering in my PhD. And throughout my stay in Korea, I mainly worked in different systems, especially manufacturing system, where I was kind of charged with different automation of particular manufacturing process, including quality control and maybe even reduction of the complexity in different systems. So after that, I did also postdoc in 3D Research Center in Korea, and then I joined CMU Africa, and right now I'm in different working group where we try to really push the boundary of what we can do using AI, especially on the continent. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And Jiahao, so Dr. Chen, so he's the CTO at Parity in New York, and has a lot of interests related to the topics of this meeting. So things like fairness, ethics, privacy, robustness, safety, and security in machine learning. He started out in computational science, and maybe he can tell us about his role in the Julia programming language as well. So Jiahao, if you want us to say a few more words about yourself.
Sure. Hello, everyone. So my name is Jiahao. Please feel free to call me Jiahao. I'm originally from Singapore, so if you're wondering what my accent is, that's where it's from. I did my PhD at the University of Illinois in chemical physics, and one of the things I did there was, I think, one of the earliest applications of machine learning to chemical simulations, taking large amounts of simulation data and summarizing it in a way that was understandable from a chemical mechanism point of view. I did my postdoc at MIT, where I worked on computational methods for solar cell material design. Later on, I switched to become a research faculty at MIT, where I started the Julia Lab. So the project as a programming language had already started before I joined. But when I co-started the lab with Alan Edelman, that was the real first academic funding infusion into the project, and I like to think that there was some part that the lab played in making the Julia language successful today. Later on, I decided to leave academia. I first joined Capital One, which is a fairly large credit card company in the US and UK. And then later I moved to JP Morgan Chase to go back to full-time research. Previously, I was a production data scientist. I built models for consumer lending problems, so probably relevant to today's discussion. I continued to work on the foundational challenges that prevent this industry from using state-of-the-art machine learning, understanding harms and risks of using AI and machine learning systems in this industry. And as of earlier this month, I am now CTO of my own startup. So Parity is a startup focusing on productionizing compliance and review solutions for users of AI regulated industries, and we're taking what I've learned from consumer banking as a starting point. And I have a guest. This is Tank. So if anyone wants to see him, just let me know in the chat. Thank you very much.
Great, excellent. So let's get going. And we want to make this interactive. So please feel free at any point, anyone in the audience, to unmute yourself and ask questions, make comments, or if you feel more comfortable posting anything that you'd like in the chat window, and I'll do my best to monitor that. But if I miss something, I mean, please just speak up. Right? So as I said, we wanted to kind of ground our discussion in somewhat of a somewhat realistic but still fictionalized sort of scenario. So consider this as the scenario. Okay. So there's a bank and a telecommunications provider who are partnering to launch a new mobile money-based lending product in a Central African nation. Right? And the key part is that this is a lending product. So the bank is taking on some risk, and so customers will have to apply to be approved for the credit and receive the loans. And these organizations are thinking about whether they should use machine learning in this credit approval process. And so what we wanted to kind of go back and forth a little bit on is thinking about this and kind of thinking about what are the possible harms, what can we do about them, and so forth, right? So the first question we wanted to pose is, should the bank and the telco even use machine learning? Because there's all sorts of problems in the world. Not all of them actually need machine learning solutions. So what would be some reasons, or what would be your thought process? Moise, Jiahao, is this something that we should maybe be thinking about machine learning for, or is it something to completely stay away from, or are there some reasons that we should be just a little bit careful?
All right, let me go first. So I actually believe, just like many of the problems, the end goal usually kind of, help you decide what kind of means you need to use in terms of reaching the goal. So let's say you're trying to give away money because you want to help, poor people who are struggling. Then the question is, can you define what is poor? So if the rule is simple, then probably don't need machine learning, right? And so, but, thinking with this bank that we have in mind, maybe the goal is to maximize their profit, and they don't have enough information on the people who are asking for this loan. So probably there's kind of like a strong belief that using different data and using AI can actually help with answering some of the questions you might need to ask before you give a loan. So yes, the answer will be, it's something you need to explore. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Jiahao, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think my first instinct is to pose first, like for what purpose. So I think the purpose clearly is important for deciding, like, first of all, what is the scale of what needs to be done? Can I do it manually? Or failing which, how do I automate the process? And does that automation necessarily involve machine learning, or is this something that you can encode as maybe some sort of expert system of rules that you implement? So to give you some idea of the scale here, when I worked at Capital One had about 50 million credit card users. So you just imagine, like, if some people will use their credit cards every day, other people will use it every now and then. But we're talking about many transactions a day. Something goes wrong, you call the company to complain about a declined transaction or a fraud report. That also adds up in terms of operations problems, and so on and so forth. So this is one end of the scale, and then the other end of the scale is something like mortgage lending, where yes, there are people who buy and sell houses, but the mortgages themselves don't come in as frequently as like a credit card application or like a customer phone call. So that's a situation where you might imagine, okay, first of all, the cost of making a mistake for mortgage probably is higher than for making a mistake on a credit card approval. So maybe I want more process around this, and I want more safeguards, and maybe that adds to the complexity of the process you're trying to automate. And so that might be actually more difficult than saying, well, I trust you with a $500 credit card. It's not that much to me if you default on it. Yeah, I'll just pause there.
Yeah, no, so, I mean, great points overall. So I think one of the points was around having some data which would potentially be relevant, whether the criteria are already clear and could be encoded in rules or not. The scale, so could humans do this, or do we really need to have automation? What are the costs and the objective functions that we're really talking about if we look at the entire process? And one thing that we didn't talk about is kind of the broader societal sort of aspects, I think. So if we do automate things, those are less jobs for human loan officers, for example. Another thing is, is the problem somehow, could it be misused in certain ways to kind of be an instrument of oppression, or kind of do something like just seriously wrong in the process itself? And I think in this particular example, that's not the case. I mean, trying to approve loans for small small sort of businesses or individual people is generally seen as a good thing. I mean, it's not something that is going to be oppressive or anything like that. And also, from the big picture of the jobs and so forth, yes, I mean, maybe automation does reduce some jobs, but it creates other ones. So I mean, kind of creating the data collection sort of jobs, the data curation jobs, managing the machine learning. I mean, there's many other sort of things that are needed. So on whole, I think we can assume that this is maybe some problem that we should be potentially tackling through machine learning. But now let's dive in and think about what do we need to be careful about, and where does this, where can possible harms come up? All right, so so before getting into that, so both of our panelists have had a lot of different lived experiences, and so one thing that we wanted to talk about a little bit is have either of them faced any discrimination in their lives? And keeping this lending sort of application in mind, but in general, interacting with new societies, places where they aren't necessarily from the majority population and so forth. So if whoever wants to go first, if you have any thoughts to share about your own personal experiences.
Maybe I can start. So I will say that I had a very different experience growing up in Singapore, where I was part of the majority race. And then coming to the US, where Asian Americans were definitely not a very large fraction of the population. I think there were, I don't know, I feel like this could be its whole entire panel, but I'll just focus on just even that label of Asian is not something that I grew up with, and then I had to learn that that was a label that other people in America would use for me. So there's some identity issues there. and then coming into the workplace, corporate America, realizing that this thing called the model minority myth, where we feel like sandwich in the middle. Like, we, on one hand, it looks like, oh, we're all very successful. So we don't need any privilege, or like we don't need any sort of advantage or some sort of affirmative action. But yet at the same time, like Asian Americans are vastly underrepresented in positions of senior leadership in US companies. That Asian Americans often are stereotyped as people who know how to do, but not necessarily what they're doing. And just fighting against that stereotype of like bad communicator, doesn't understand how to advocate for themselves. And then, of course, like, thinking back to my own growing up in Singapore and going like, oh, like, this is what it means to be both on the inside and then on the outside in a different context. I'll leave.
Thanks, Dr. Chen. And so for me, it's a little bit similar in some sense. He actually reminded me something that I used to say, that I didn't know I was Black until I actually, left Rwanda. And it's, like when everybody looks like you, you never really think of race because, but at some point you start, kind of reflecting. But with respect to actually learn and so on, I lived in Korea for 12 years, but I didn't even have like a credit score. And, this kind of stuff, which means I wasn't eligible for any loan, but, I pay rent, I use, all different activities that, you need to be able to qualify for many of these. But because somehow I'm a foreigner, which to no fault of their own, the system, the way the system is set up has a bias against, people who are not from that community, right? So, this is kind of very applicable to what we're saying, because, if you live in a place for more than 10 years, probably you should be eligible to get some of, some of the privilege that, the local people have, but sometimes it's not the case. And yeah, so yeah, I'll leave to that as well.
Great, thanks. And I mean, you bring up an interesting point, Moise, that you're almost invisible in that society, in some official sort of channels. And so, I mean, we're taking a data-driven sort of approach. You wouldn't even appear in the data. And if we're building then machine learning models based on that data, then there's no chance for any of your patterns or your sort of circumstances to be reflected. And I think that is an overlooked sort of aspect. Sometimes we kind of talk about different sources of bias and so forth, but people completely missing from the data are just as important. So coming to the next sort of question that I wanted to pose is, what are your thoughts on how different social biases, some of them that we just talked about and others, can manifest in machine learning models? Then it can be in various points in the development lifecycle. So it could be in the data understanding and data preparation. It could be in the modeling and elsewhere. So if you guys want to share some thoughts on where do these biases, where does unfairness potentially come from, and feel free to ground it in any of your lived experiences or what you've seen in practice as well.
Yeah, okay, so maybe let me go first. And it's really no different from, I feel like this topic is actually interesting because the bias is not restricted to AI. And even when you think of AI, you really think of a system that tried to kind of, mimic a human. And so oftentimes what it learns, it comes from, what we usually do. So the bias that we see in society are usually like the one seen AI kind of reflective of what's exists in the real world. So, which means like whatever is learning, if it does exist, somehow it's probably going to get picked up even in this automated system because they are learning from biased data. So that being said, like clear example can really come from, as you put it, some of the people, even some experience can actually be invisible to this machine. And so you wouldn't expect the machine to kind of, give a weight to that experience, even though for that particular person, when you say like one person died, you feel it's nothing, but for that person who lost his son, it's a big deal. So, and in kind of similar context, when, you're training a machine learning model and like, for instance, the whole training data set does not include someone with disability, then that means like whatever output, whatever system you're going to end up with is not going to take into account that person with disability. So so those kind of stuff, like the underrepresentation. And even for you, if I ask you to just go build a building with limited resources, you all obviously going to say like, I'm not going to make sure that with this kind of needs is going to have access to this building. Usually that comes later, and I feel like it's the same way with the machine.
Yeah, great point. And so, yeah, I mean, we should be thinking about these things throughout. I mean, not as something to sprinkle on at the end. We'll get to kind of what we might want to be doing in order to mitigate some of the unfairness issues. But before that, Jiahao, if you have any thoughts to share on how social biases manifest.
Yeah, so I was just thinking yesterday about like what are facts that I learned that I was very surprised to learn, and I think that most people in the world probably don't know. So I'll post 3 of them. So the first one is, in which year were women in the United States allowed to first open a bank account without the explicit approval of a husband or wife or father? That's the first question. My second question is, how many slaves did JP Morgan chase on throughout history? The third one is, how many adults in New York City do not have a bank account?
I can try to guess. So on the first question, women opening bank accounts without permission from their husbands or fathers. Let me venture 1973.
Oh, you're very, very close. So yeah,
Close?
I think 1974 was when they passed the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which gave women the ability to do so legally. But I need to trace the history to find out exactly when was the first such account opened, because I'm sure there was some lag. But yeah, Kush, that was a great guess.
Good.
Or maybe you knew the answer.
No, I didn't know, but it seemed like it should have been somewhat related to, yeah, I mean, the civil rights era and stuff. So that's what I was going towards. So why don't we ask the audience for the other 2? So if people want to post in the chat or unmute themselves. So Jiahao's second question was about J. Pierpont Morgan and whether how many slaves, right? So do you want to repeat the question?
Sure. So JP Morgan, the bank, did they own slaves in the past, and how many, if you think the answer is yes?
So the bank itself, or the
bank?
Okay.
Yes.
The bank. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So I didn't even know that institutions own slaves. So that's news to me.
Oh boy, that's a whole lecture in that question.
Okay. All right. So any ventures from anyone from the audience?
I also acknowledge that this is a sensitive topic, so many people may not want to discuss it in a public forum. Yeah.
Sorry, Kush, could you maybe just repeat the question? I think
So the bank, the JP Morgan banking institution. So over its history, how many slaves has it owned or did own? Yeah, so Jiahao posted it in the chat as well, the question. Anyone want to venture a number?
I suspect many of us would be guessing, to be honest.
Maybe I'll just give the answer. So in 2005, there was a law passed by the city of Chicago that required that financial institutions operating in Chicago had to disclose their ties to slavery. And as part of that disclosure, we learned that JP Morgan Chase at one point held as many as 13,000 humans as collateral and outright owned about 1,250. And the answer is because they used JP Morgan, the bank, used to be a big financer of plantations in the U.S. before the Civil War, and that meant getting into the dirty economics of owning people.
Yeah, and then the third question, Jiahao, if you want to just state it and state the answer as well.
Yeah. So to recap the third question, what percentage of the adults of New York City don't have a bank account? Bear in mind that New York City is probably the city involved with the largest number of banks ever. Possibly, or maybe London is more, or somewhere else like that. But like, you know, in a financial capital of the world, how many adults don't have a bank account? I think maybe in the interest of time, I'll just tell you the answers. So in 2018, the City of New York commissioned a study, and the answer is 9%.
Sorry, say it again.
9% is the answer.
Okay.
All right. So why do I bring these questions up? I think as computer scientists, we fall into this trap of premature abstraction. We say that, okay, well, this is an example of this kind of problem, therefore I can apply this kind of solution. But the reality on the ground is immensely more complex because of the context of what you're trying to do. So imagine that, you know, we're just talking about something that looks very benign, like should people get a mortgage? But you know, if you're talking about mortgages, you're talking about housing discrimination, we're talking about racial segregation in the United States and in other countries. We're talking about the fact that there's all this historical skew in the data, and even more fundamentally than that, like just the notion of credit or home ownership is an intrinsically culturally specific process. Like the fact that we are, I mean, myself growing up in Singapore, we struggle and continue to struggle with like our own post-colonial identity. We inherited all these institutions from the British government of the day, but are these really the right notions and structures to even capture what does it mean to own land in this place?
Yeah,
right. That was very dense. I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, no, thanks, Joe. Lots to think about. And yeah, some other things I just wanted to mention on this point is we often think about it's just that, I mean, everything is coming from data, but there's actually subjective choices that come up as we're doing feature engineering, data preparation, and so forth, that can actually also lead to biases. So this is not so well recognized, but just as an example, one of my colleagues at IBM Research, Maninder Singh, he recently did some analysis where he was looking at some healthcare data, and it's somewhat become a little bit well known that if you use cost of healthcare for an individual as a proxy for how sick they are, or their healthcare utilization as a proxy for how sick they are, you actually are misrepresenting African Americans, and because they tend to use the healthcare system in the US much less for the same level of how sick they are for various structural and historical reasons. And so what he found was actually, this is true when you aggregate all the different costs together. So whether it's the cost of emergency room visits and primary care visits, inpatient, outpatient, everything together. And also, but what happens is that if you leave these costs separately, as very like individual features, most of that bias goes away. So it's kind of interesting. Like it's a very natural thing to do as a data scientist. You have a bunch of features. There's a lot of zeros in them, so you just combine them all into one feature so that you have fewer zeros and it's maybe a more meaningful sort of variable. And just that process of doing that exacerbates biases quite a bit. And it's not something intentional or anything. And so we need to kind of think about what's going on throughout the life cycle. It's not just something to worry about at one point or the other and so forth. All right, so moving on, and please, if there's any questions or comments, please speak up. Just to broaden the discussion a little bit, we've started with fairness and kind of bias and discrimination, but if we're talking about these small loans that are being given through a mobile money sort of approach in a Central African nation, what are the other considerations for trustworthy AI that we should be thinking about? So just to throw a few out there: privacy, robustness, security, and so forth. What might you also want to consider?
So I'm going to turn the question on its head. Because you know I like to do this. So I think trustworthy AI tends to come across as, here's a laundry list of things. You need to have privacy, you need to have the list you have fairness, explainability, and then people think about explainability versus interpretability versus transparency or whatever. I think actually that definition, if you define something as a list of things, I feel like it's missing the point. I think the point here about trustworthy AI is are all the stakeholders present and identified in the design and execution of the AI system. Right? And so different stakeholders have different needs, and that's how they bring in these concerns. But it's really about making sure that everyone's concerns and risks are voiced, they're managed appropriately in the design and execution. And we can talk more about that later. I'll leave it.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And yeah, no, I certainly agree with it. Yeah, disparate lists are not the most useful sort of thing. I'll let Moise kind of give his thoughts, and then I have one, thing to also add to this as well. But let's hear from Moise.
Thank you. So I actually agree, because all these different things that you need to cover, kind of like in a way, trying to put together the whole idea of like, is this system, working for everyone involved? And obviously, I tended to kind of like use just the word itself. Like when you say something is trustworthy, like is a human is trustworthy, like what does it mean? And I feel like it goes the same way, with respect to AI. So I like, is he going to treat me fairly? Like if I made a mistake, yes, I deserve to be punished, but if I did good, I deserve to be rewarded. And at the same time, like there's a component that I kind of feel like, maybe I should just mention is like many of these systems, or like even human, when you say someone is trustworthy, it doesn't mean he never make a mistake. But then what happened, when he actually make a mistake, he usually apologize, he usually, rectify his wrong and so on. So I feel like that part where, even though we have this AI, to be trustworthy is that, okay, if you make a mistake, how can we really kind of like acknowledge the problem and maybe do our best to kind of rectify the problem? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really an interesting point. The one thing that I do want to say is, and I think Jiahao was listening to a panel I did actually last week, in which I was mentioning, I mean, what are attributes of trustworthy people? Because I think that is very important for us to have some understanding of before we even get to AI. And it turns out that in the organizational management literature, they do, I mean, kind of have some attributes of trustworthy people. It is still a list, so it doesn't get away from Jiahao's point, but I think it's valuable to at least kind of understand what has been said there. So the first attribute being that the other person is competent at what they're doing. So competence doesn't mean you're 100% right all the time, but it means that you have some minimal level of ability to do what you say you're going to do. Then there's reliability, so that that competence kind of sticks around in different conditions, different settings, and so forth. And then there's some level of openness, so that you can communicate back and forth with the other person. And as Moise was saying, that there should be some recourse, right? That if the other person has made a mistake, you should have the ability to tell them, and they should listen to you, and can go back and forth with them, and so forth. And then the last, I think, is what Jiahao was emphasizing, which is that that other person, if they're trustworthy, should have goals that go beyond just themselves. They should be thinking for the greater good in some sense. And I think an important point to make is that when we say good, that is a value judgment already. So the power to define what is good shouldn't be in the hands of necessarily just the people who are the most powerful, and so forth. So these systems, these people should be empowering others to express their values, and so forth as well. So that's just my kind of what I've understood. And just relating this back to the lending sort of case, the reliability aspect, I think, is probably one of the more important ones here, because when you have training data, it could have come from that same country. It could have come from some other country, because this is a new lending product, right? So maybe there's not enough data. So how to make sure that the data distribution that you're training on is actually going to apply in that particular setting is a very critical sort of thing. And since it's in our fictional scenario, it's a mobile money sort of thing. So how do you prevent attacks and people trying to fool the system into giving them loans and so forth? So I think there's a lot of considerations that we do need to have. And I think there's I think, I mean, both Moise and Jiahao's points are, I mean, extremely important. That like, who are we empowering? Whose voice is really being expressed? And then making sure that there's some level of like intellectual humbleness in the machine learning system, the AI system, so that it can recognize it on its own that it might be wrong, and tell you about it, and so forth. So I think there's a lot to be said here. Would you disagree, Jiahao, Moise, or would any sort of thing that you want to say that I said is wrong? Or
Yeah, sorry, I would just qualify this this question of trust here.
Yeah.
So I dropped in the chat a reference to a book I'm still reading by Suzaki Dalbo. He wrote specifically about how the human machine trust is different from human trust. So while the trust obviously is an idea we originate from working with other humans. He's done some research on how it's different from machines like that, and how so he talks about things like, well, the fact that machines exist to enable scale. It means like mistakes are amplified. It means that displacement feels like it's like non-recursable. Like, oh, like my manager fired me versus like the algorithm fired me. Like it evokes a very different emotional response. So so I think that's something to be aware of, that like it's actually not the idea of trust from the human world doesn't exactly translate over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think being worthy of trust and being trusted are different as well. So I think the fact that something has properties innately that make it worthy of trust, whether it's a person or machine, is its own sort of thing. And then whether humans then actually trust it or not. And I mean, something can be worthy and not be trusted. It can be not worthy and be trusted, and so forth. So I think there's, I mean, two levels to this as well. Moise, did you have anything else that you wanted to say before we continue on?
Yeah, so in some sense, I actually agree with everything that was said on this topic, and maybe like to really kind of like to make it easy to understand for me at least, like when you make things a little bit personal, it feels like you can kind of like put yourself in different shoes to kind of understand what's how do you feel about this, and the trustworthiness, like the reliability of this, like when you say I trust this person to kind of like keep an eye on my child, so I leave and he can stay home and keep an eye on my child. So whether someone is actually my cousin and I love him, sometimes there are different things that I need to look at before I can say like, okay, stay here with my 1 year old baby. It's not because I hate you, it's not because that I don't trust you, but I need to see how you've done this before. Like, did you remember? So, that kind of reliability, like, is it safe? Like, can you have what level of unexpected can I kind of, think of with this, system? I feel like they all add up to kind of even understanding what it does. I think it's something very important. Like, if I don't know what's in your head, probably I'm kind of worried that, yes, I don't have a reason not to trust you, but I'm not sure, where I stand on that side, right? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, let's actually skip over to this question. I mean, you brought it up, so kind of knowing what's in the other person's head or in the system's head. So, I mean, you already mentioned it, that kind of having some model or mental model of that other person, of that that AI system, is really helpful. So, I mean, transparency or explainability, interpretability, all of those are somewhat helpful, I would say. But others would argue that it's actually maybe not so important, because you never look into what the other person is actually thinking. I mean, that you just kind of have to believe what they tell you and so forth. So, so any thoughts on this? And Jiahao, I know your startup is doing a lot on the governance side of things. So if you wanted to share anything there.
Sure. Yeah. So as Moise brought up earlier, like let's go back to like, why do we even need these things in the first place? Like, we want trust. We want trust in the system, and that means like, can we see when it makes mistakes, and when mistakes are made, like, do we have due process for fixing those mistakes? Right. So, and again, in a lending situation, these are, I mean, like, it's the cost of making a mistake in a lending decision is pretty significant compared to like, oh, I made a mistake in labeling an image. Okay, like maybe the label you gave was really bad, like the Black Pupa's Gorillas label, but it's arguably like even more insidious if you falsely denied someone a mortgage, and by falsely denying the mortgage, they don't get a chance to improve their credit history, establish it. They don't therefore get the chance to refinance. They don't get a chance to upgrade later in life. Um, Credit is a system that is built around individual level feedback. So credit begets more credit, and it's, in a way, credit itself is a codification of financial trust. Like, how much does a financial institution think they should trust you with repaying money that you owe them? Right? Being able to understand if the bank doesn't trust you to pay your loan, that you understand why, and maybe you're not happy with the answer, but at least like you don't dispute the fact, like, oh, maybe you had a bankruptcy, maybe you do have outstanding debt that is so high that like maybe it doesn't make sense to give you a car loan or something like that.
Yep, thanks. And do you want to explain maybe to the audience what, I mean, this term governance really means? When we say governance, what is that?
Yeah, so I'm trying to do it in a way that's not overly US specific, but I'll mention that in the US we have explicit regulatory requirements for AI systems used in banks. Or really, let me take that back. So it's really any kind of algorithmic process for decision making in banks has to undergo some sort of governance process, which means that first when you build a model, you need to declare like what is it going to be used for, what's the data we're using for it. It needs to go through review to make sure like does it make sense to predict the thing you want to predict from the data that you have. So does it make sense that you can predict credit worthiness from a credit score? There's a whole, it's not that straightforward, but like the conventional answer is yes, because that's the metric that we designed for this purpose. But maybe something like, oh, we use the color of your car as a feature to predict credit worthiness. And then you go like, oh, wait, does that actually make sense? I'm not sure if that makes sense. So governance is around like making sure that there's due process for documentation. Are there risks that could be identified in doing the thing that you want to do? Are those risks put on paper so that they can be discussed and mitigated? So and this is all part of the process of like understanding things like how much money am I going to lose if I make a mistake? What is the downstream cost of like my bottom line impact of like losing out on loans or like losing customer value and retention, those kinds of things. Sorry, I think maybe I'll pause here for now.
Yeah, sure. No, thanks. This was really enlightening. Yeah, I guess a couple more questions, and then we have a few more minutes, so I would want some more audience participation as well. But a couple more questions that I had prepared is how can the bank mitigate various risks of harm? Can having more humans in the loop, not being fully autonomous sort of systems help, and so forth? I think we've covered them in various ways.